He walked into the room with nothing but a dream in his heart and worn-out shoes on his feet. But before he could even sit down, the laughter started. They mocked his skin, his poverty, his very existence, loud enough for everyone to hear, cruel, enough to leave scars that would last for years. To them, he was just the poor black kid who would never be more than a joke. But what none of them knew was that life had a way of turning tables. And soon, those same voices would fall silent in the most unexpected place. He was born into a home that had little to offer in material wealth, but overflowed with love and determination. His mother, Denise, woke before dawn every day, her tired hands wrapping around a chipped coffee mug before heading out to her first job. She scrubbed floors in homes far wealthier than her own, often ignored by the people whose messes she cleaned. By evening, she put on a different uniform, serving tables at a diner where tips were scarce and smiles even scarcer. Yet, despite her exhaustion, she always came home with a gentle word for her son, believing that her sacrifice would somehow build him a better tomorrow. His father, Marcus, had once dreamed of becoming a teacher. He had the sharp mind, the patience, and the passion to inspire young minds. But doors closed quickly for him, some with polite excuses, others with none at all. He ended up taking construction jobs when they were available, hauling bricks and steel under the unforgiving sun. Every rejection, every whispered reminder of not fitting in, hardened him. But he carried that weight quietly so his son wouldn't see the toll it took. Their home was small, just 2 rooms in an aging apartment complex where the walls were thin and the neighbors just as weary of struggle. But for the boy, Jamal, those 4 walls held the only place where he felt safe. Outside was another story. School was supposed to be his escape, the place where he could learn, dream, and imagine a future bigger than poverty. But instead, it became a battlefield of whispers, stares, and cruel laughter. The other kids noticed everything. The second-hand clothes that never fit quite right, the shoes with fading soles, the lunch tray with less food than theirs. They noticed the color of his skin too, not with curiosity, but with the kind of sharpness that stung like a blade. Jamal was smart, brilliant even. He loved numbers and had an uncanny ability to see patterns where others only saw confusion. Teachers admired his quiet diligence, but admiration could only shield him so far. His so-called friends, the ones who sometimes played basketball with him after school, were also the first to mock him when the crowd grew. They didn't just laugh at his poverty, they laughed at him. It was the kind of laughter that stuck to the bones. Poor kid. Why don't you ask your mom to clean up my house too? Careful, don't let him touch you, or you'll end up like him. The insults weren't shouted in classrooms. They were whispered in hallways, smirked on playgrounds, and carved into his memory with every passing day. At first, Jamal tried to brush it off. He would go home, bury himself in books, and remind himself of what his mother always said. Baby, the world won't always see you for who you are, but you better never forget it yourself. He believed her, or at least he tried to. But children can only take so much before the weight of cruelty starts to leave marks. Sometimes Jamal would walk home slower just to avoid the groups of kids who waited to jeer. Sometimes he'd sit in the library, pretending to read, while secretly just trying to hide. He became quieter, sharper, storing every ounce of pain, not as weakness, but as something else, something growing. And yet, buried deep within that silence was a fire, a determination born not from privilege, but from survival. Jamal didn't have the luxury of fitting in. He had no choice but to stand out. The world around him didn't expect much. His classmates saw only a poor black kid destined to stay at the bottom. Teachers, though kinder, still sometimes carried pity in their eyes, instead of belief. Even the neighborhood knew the pattern all too well. Young men like Jamal either broke themselves working for scraps or got swallowed by the streets. But Jamal was different. Every laugh, every insult, every whisper of doubt became fuel. While others wasted afternoons chasing popularity, he poured himself into studying, working odd jobs, saving every coin he could. He listened more than he spoke. He planned more than he played. The stage was being set, though no one around him could see it yet. His so-called friends thought their words would haunt him forever. But in reality, they were building the very man who would one day turn the tables in ways they never imagined. For now, though, Jamal remained quiet, steady, and underestimated. The world saw a poor black boy. What they didn't see was the storm he was becoming. As Jamal grew older, the laughter didn't stop. It sharpened. Middle school brought new layers of cruelty. His classmates had discovered the power of social media, and suddenly, his poverty and skin color weren't just a joke in the hallways, they were broadcast online for the world to see. Pictures of his worn-out shoes were snapped and shared. His name was twisted into nicknames meant to strip him of dignity. One cruel post read, "Future Janitor of the Month." Another captioned his picture, "Don't sit too close or you'll catch broke." The sting of mockery followed him everywhere. Teachers, overwhelmed with overcrowded classrooms, often looked the other way. Some even unconsciously fed into the bias, expecting less of him, excusing him from opportunities they believed were beyond his reach. Once, when the school announced a science competition, Jamal eagerly signed up, only to overhear a teacher whisper to a colleague, "He won't last a week. This isn't for kids like him." But Jamal did last. He stayed late in the library, borrowing books others ignored. He pieced together experiments with scraps, making up for what he couldn't buy. And yet, when the results came in, his victory was met not with applause but suspicion. Parents of other students complained that someone must have helped him, that a kid like that couldn't possibly do this on his own. The trophy he earned became another reminder that no matter how hard he worked, prejudice would always try to steal the shine. High school was no kinder. By then, Jamal had grown taller, stronger, and quieter. Silence had become his shield, but it only fueled more taunts. On the basketball court, he was good, better than most. But when he outplayed, his white teammates, the compliments turned sour. "Show off," they muttered. "Ball hog." And when he stumbled, their laughter was merciless. Guess money can't buy skill either. The cafeteria was a stage for daily humiliation. Jamal often skipped lunch, unwilling to face the jeers about his empty tray. When he did eat, his food was mocked for being cheap or gross. He learned to keep his head down, to endure, but each insult carved something permanent inside him. The most painful blows didn't always come from peers. There were moments when authority itself turned against him. A store manager once accused him of shoplifting when all he carried was a notebook he had saved up to buy. The police were called. The humiliation of standing outside while officers patted him down, hands trembling in front of strangers, branded itself into his memory. He was released with no apology, just a cold warning. Be careful who you look like next time, and still, Jamal endured. But endurance doesn't erase pain, it transforms it. Every cruel word, every false accusation, every mocking laugh became fuel. He studied harder, worked longer hours, and saved every cent he could. While his peers partied on weekends, Jamal stocked shelves in corner stores, mopped diner floors, and shoveled driveways in the winter. What little he earned went into a secret savings jar hidden under his bed. Yet the conflict never stopped escalating. In his senior year, as graduation approached, his so-called friends, the same boys who mocked him daily, nominated him for a cruel award, least likely to succeed. When his name was called during the senior banquet, laughter exploded across the room. He forced a smile, pretending it didn't matter, but deep inside, the humiliation burned hotter than fire. That night, he lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling of his bedroom, his fists clenched, vowing silently that one day they would regret every word. College seemed impossible. Scholarships were scarce, and his family couldn't afford tuition. Guidance counselors suggested he be realistic, steering him toward low-paying trade work, but Jamal refused to accept their limitations as his destiny. He applied anyway, filling out form after form, writing essays by candlelight when the electricity was cut off. Rejections came in waves, each one heavier than the last, and then one acceptance letter slipped through. A small university, not prestigious, but it was a chance. Jamal grabbed it with both hands, working part-time jobs to cover what scholarships couldn't. Even there, the racism followed him. Professors underestimated him. Classmates excluded him from study groups, whispering that he was only there to fill a quota. Group projects left him doing all the work while others took the credit. But Jamal refused to be broken. Nights blurred into mornings as he studied, balancing shifts at fast food counters with grueling coursework. He poured himself into learning business, finance, and technology, anything that could one day lift him out of the cycle he was trapped in. By graduation, Jamal had achieved more than anyone expected. But the world didn't open its doors easily. Job interviews ended with polite smiles that masked bias. Not the right fit, they told him, even when his qualifications outshone the rest. Bills piled up. Doubt crept in. The voices of his past echoed louder. Least likely to succeed, and yet, in the silence of his struggle, Jamal built something no one saw coming. He started small, freelance work, odd consulting jobs, side hustles that barely kept the lights on. But step by step, brick by brick, he laid the foundation for something greater, his own business. It was nothing glamorous at first, a tiny office, second-hand equipment, and a dream larger than the walls could hold, but Jamal poured everything into it. He studied markets, built networks, worked through nights while others slept. Slowly, his company grew. Contracts came in. Opportunities opened. What began as survival turned into success. And as Jamal's business expanded, the world around him shifted. Investors who once ignored him now sought his attention. Newspapers that had overlooked his achievements began to write stories of the unlikely entrepreneur, and one by one resumes started to flood his inbox. Among them were familiar names. The very same boys who had laughed at his poverty, the ones who had mocked his shoes, his clothes, his hunger. Now they were asking him for a chance, for a job, for a future. Jamal stared at their applications, his hands steady, his heart heavy. He remembered the banquet, the laughter, the pain, and he realized the tables had turned. But what would he do next? The office building hummed with quiet energy, sunlight pouring through tall glass windows that looked out over the city skyline. It was a view Jamal had once only dreamed of, a view he used to sketch on scraps of paper when the world told him he would never rise higher than a mop bucket. Now, it was his reality. His company, his name on the door, his employees filling the halls. But on this day, as Jamal scanned the list of scheduled interviews for new hires, his heart caught in his throat. Names, familiar names. He blinked twice, certain his eyes were playing tricks. But no, they were there. The same boys who had once laughed until their faces turned red at the sight of his torn shoes. The ones who had called him hopeless, who had mocked him online, who had stripped away his dignity at every turn. Now, their resumes sat on his desk. For a long moment, Jamal stared at the papers, his fingers tracing the typed words. College. Degrees, job experience, neat bullet points meant to impress. They looked polished, confident, capable. But to him, they were not just resumes. They were echoes of the past. Each page carried the weight of insults, the sting of humiliation, the sound of cruel laughter still ringing in his ears. He could have rejected them without a thought. He could have thrown the papers in the trash and moved on. But something deeper stirred inside him. This was not just about revenge. It was about truth. About showing them the reality of the boy they once despised. When the interviews began, Jamal sat tall behind his desk, his tailored suit crisp, his presence commanding. One by one, the applicants were ushered in, and one by one, their faces faltered when they saw him. Recognition dawned slowly, like a shadow creeping across their features. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others forced smiles, their confidence cracking under the weight of memory. "Jamal?" one finally stammered, disbelief coating his voice. Jamal didn't answer right away. He let the silence hang heavy in the room, just as it had hung heavy around him in school hallways when their laughter had suffocated him. Finally, he spoke, his tone calm, even measured. "Yes. Jamal, the same kid you all once thought would never amount to anything." Their eyes widened, darting toward one another, searching for escape. But there was none. They were here because they needed him. He leaned forward, his gaze steady, unflinching. "You laughed at me. You mocked me. You made sure I never forgot. I was poor, that I was different. But here we are." The room was silent, the air thick with the weight of truth. One of them cleared his throat, fumbling for words. "We were just kids, man. We didn't mean—" But Jamal cut him off with a raised hand. Don't diminish it. Because while you laughed, I worked. While you tried to break me, I built myself. And now," he gestured to the office around him, "now, you're here asking me for a job." Their shame was palpable. Shoulders slumped, eyes dropped to the floor. The arrogance that had once filled their voices was gone, replaced by quiet, desperation. And yet, Jamal felt no joy in their humiliation. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice. About reclaiming the power they had tried to strip from him. He asked each of them the same question, his voice steady, almost gentle. "Tell me, why should I give you the chance you never gave me?" They stumbled over answers, their words clumsy, their excuses weak. Jamal listened, but his mind drifted. He remembered the cafeteria where they laughed at his empty tray, the senior banquet where they crowned him least likely to succeed. The night he lay awake, fists clenched, vowing he would prove them wrong. And now he had. By the time the interviews ended, the truth was undeniable. The balance of power had shifted. They needed him. Their futures rested in his hands. As Jamal leaned back in his chair, staring at the skyline beyond his office window, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He could turn them away, let them taste the rejection he had swallowed for years. Or he could extend his hand, proving that he was bigger than their cruelty. The choice was his. And as the door closed behind the last applicant, Jamal sat in silence, the echoes of the past colliding with the reality of the present. He had become everything they said he never would, but the question now was simple. Would he give them the second chance they had denied him? The office was silent, long after the last of Jamal's former classmates had walked out. Papers still lay scattered across his desk, resumes full of credentials, carefully polished words, and carefully hidden desperation. But none of that mattered compared to the faces behind them, the faces that had once twisted in laughter at... His pain now wore shame, uncertainty, and regret. Jamal leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He thought of his mother, still waking up before sunrise to head to work. He thought of his father, hands cracked and calloused from years of labor that never paid enough. He thought of himself as a boy, sitting in the back of the classroom, trying to focus on equations while whispers stung his ears. And he thought of those nights when he had wanted to give up, when the voices of cruelty had been louder than the voice of hope. And yet, here he was. Success had given him power, but it had also given him something more valuable: perspective. He could see clearly now what had once been hidden behind cruelty. Their laughter had not been strength, it had been fear. Fear of someone who was different. Fear of someone who didn't fit the mold they thought the world required. The next morning, Jamal returned to his office and made his decision. Some of the resumes he set aside for rejection, not out of spite, but because their skills didn't match his company's needs. But a few he placed in a separate pile, the pile of those he would hire. Not because he had forgotten their cruelty, but because he had outgrown it. When those calls went out, shock filled their voices. They didn't expect mercy. They didn't expect a second chance from the boy they had once tried to crush. And perhaps that was the true justice, that their future now depended on the very person they had dismissed as worthless. Working under Jamal was not easy for them. Every day they entered an office where his name was on the wall, his authority absolute. Every paycheck they cashed bore the signature of the man they had once humiliated. But Jamal didn't mistreat them. He didn't throw their cruelty back in their faces. Instead, he demanded from them what he demanded from everyone: respect, accountability, and hard work. It was humbling. It was transformative. Slowly, the arrogance drained from their voices. They saw in Jamal not the boy they had mocked, but the man he had become, the man their cruelty had forged, the man who had risen higher than they ever dreamed. And though their shame would never fully fade, some began to change. They worked harder. They treated others with more care. They learned slowly the lesson Jamal had already mastered. Dignity cannot be stolen, only surrendered. Outside the office, Jamal's story began to spread. Articles were written about the young black entrepreneur who had risen from poverty and prejudice to build an empire. His story became a beacon of inspiration, not only for those who shared his struggle, but for anyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Schools invited him to speak, and when he walked into classrooms filled with children who looked like him, he saw in their eyes the same hunger he had once carried. He told them the truth, that the world would not always be kind, that prejudice would try to break them, that they would be laughed at, doubted, and dismissed. But he also told them that none of that defined them. What defined them was their choice to rise anyway. At one school, a young boy raised his hand and asked, "But what if they never stop laughing at us?" Jamal smiled softly. "Then you let their laughter become your fire. You let it remind you of what you're fighting for. And one day, when they're done laughing, they'll have no choice but to listen." The weight of his words rippled through the room, leaving silence in its wake, a silence of understanding, of recognition, of hope. Back in his community, Jamal didn't just build wealth for himself. He reinvested it. He opened mentorship programs for underprivileged youth. He created scholarships for kids who, like him, had been told college wasn't for them. He opened doors where so many had once been slammed shut. His success wasn't just personal, it was collective. It was proof that resilience could break cycles, that justice could be achieved not only through punishment, but through transformation. And yet, for all his achievements, Jamal never forgot the pain. He carried it with him, not as a wound, but as a scar, a reminder of where he came from, and of the millions who still walk that path every day. The story was bigger than him. It was about every child mocked for their skin, every family judged for their poverty, every dream dismissed before it had a chance to breathe. Years later, Jamal stood in the same high school auditorium where he had once been humiliated with the title of least likely to succeed. Now, the school had invited him back to deliver a keynote address at graduation. He stood at the podium, looking out at rows of eager faces, and behind them, banners celebrating achievement. The memory of that night came rushing back, the laughter, the sting, the vow he had made under his breath. And now, standing before them as a man who had turned that vow into reality, his voice carried the weight of both pain and triumph. "I was once told I would never succeed," he began. "Some of you may have heard the same. Maybe you've been told you're too poor, too different, too much, or not enough. But I stand here today to tell you, those words don't define you. Your work does. Your resilience does. Your choice to rise does. The crowd erupted in applause, but Jamal raised a hand for silence. His eyes swept across the room, pausing on the very stage where he had once stood as the butt of a cruel joke. "And if anyone ever laughs at you," he continued, his voice firm, unyielding, "remember this. Laughter fades, but what you build, with your own hands, with your own determination, that lasts forever." The auditorium fell into a hush, the kind of silence that comes not from absence, but from reverence. When Jamal stepped down from the stage, he felt the weight of his journey settle into something lighter. He had come full circle. The boy who was once mocked had become the man who inspired. And as he walked out into the sunlight, he knew the story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated, ridiculed, or pushed aside. Because in the end, the greatest justice wasn't just in becoming their boss. It was in proving to the world, and to himself, that no amount of prejudice could silence a soul determined to rise. But as Jamal's story spread, one question lingered in the minds of all who heard it. A question that could not be ignored: how many more brilliant lives are still being laughed at, doubted, and dismissed today, before they're ever given a chance to shine?